right. Thank you, Jason, for a lovely intro. And thank you for the BOSC organizers for this opportunity to speak as well. So this is my title. You may notice this is quite similar to the title from our keynote this morning. We actually didn't coordinate at all, but I guess this is a very common theme today. And I actually feel quite fortunate both with the keynote this morning about agentic AI and with Amos's wonderful keynote about biocuration yesterday. I feel I've been set up kind of quite nicely to try and bridge these two universes for you. But I really just want to kind of just start off with, you heard a bit about me from Jason, and I've obviously many of you know me from the bio-ontologies world and universe, and ontologies such as Go and Uberon. But you may not all know that I actually cut my teeth in bioinformatics with the kind of predecessor to the BOSC conference. So anyone here remember a BioPearl? So way back in the yay! So I was, a small part of that project, and you probably no one uses the code I wrote for that anymore. But it did really instill, upon me a lot of the kind of like the principles for open science that we see carried on in this this conference today. And I learned a lot there, not just about openness in the kind of strict sense of you should have open licenses for all your tools and software, but just about how an open community can work together and collaborate and kind of coordinate on things such that you don't end up duplicating work and you make things that are modular, can componentized and can talk to each other. And I like to think I've managed to bring some of that thinking over across into the ontologies community. So that's why I'm doubly honored to be speaking at this this joint BOSC Boker keynote today. Anyway, here's what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll start just with talking about, because it's Boker, the knowledge representation meeting. I'll talk a bit about the role of knowledge representation in modern AI. But then I'll dive a little bit deeper into what we actually mean by knowledge representation and curation and ontology development, and how I really see it as a kind of open team science. And then we're going to look a little bit about how this new field that we've been hearing about, agentic AI, is potentially going to impact what we do with knowledge representation and with ontologies. And then I'll end with just some thoughts about overall alignment of AI, in particular alignment of AI with knowledge representation and some of our scientific values. So I think most of you here are kind of like, if I was to ask you what an ontology was, you could give a fairly good answer. Except amongst us ontologists, we can actually never really agree on the definitions of what an ontology is. So, but just for simplistic purposes, for the purpose of today's talk, an ontology I see as anything that you can kind of squeeze into BioPortal, and ontologies are used for purposes like building knowledge bases, and these are knowledge bases sensu stricto in the kind of NIH sense of resources that capture general high-level knowledge from the literature. Gene Ontology, Reactome, the MONARCH knowledge base. And ontologies are also used for data, what NIH calls data repositories as well. And this could be kind of like genomics data repositories such as ENCODE and so on. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to lump a lot of this together as essentially knowledge bases and knowledge representation. And indeed, that's what a lot of people are doing. We're kind of like taking a lot of the individual componentized knowledge that is built using for some of these different ontologies and knowledge bases and bring them together and build larger knowledge graphs that connect things together. So this is a portion of the Mondo knowledge graph, the MONARCH knowledge graph, maybe focused around a particular disease like cystic fibrosis. And you can see once you start connecting together some of these ontologies, and maybe not all of you are aware, but a lot of the ontologies that we build within the open bio ontologies are actually mini knowledge graphs in themselves. They're not just simple taxonomies or hierarchies. They include relationships. So, there might be relationships from terms within the Mondo ontology, such as cystic fibrosis, to the underlying genetic etiology, the genes. And then you can traverse from these genes into kind of like other named entities, such as mutations and so on. So a lot of this knowledge representation really goes to power a lot of the new modern kind of foundational model AI that we are hearing about. When you do hear about these models, the main story you might hear is that they're built using huge amounts of unlabeled genomic data or protein data. You just kind of like gather as much of this information as possible, and you can do a lot with just figuring out the underlying patterns and the grammar of the genome by using kind of like semi-supervised methods in pre-training. But where a lot of the value comes in is where you have labeled data. Data is labeled using ontologies to fine-tune these models and to actually kind of like deploy them for useful tasks. So there are many examples of this. I particularly like this from the recent Alpha Genome paper. So this is a really impressive foundational model. It will tell you you can use it for multiple purposes. You can use it to examine the effects of mutations on the genome, and it can tell you what some of the functional implications of those are. But what I think is really cool about it is it will contextualize this by the underlying cell type and the underlying tissue. And what the Alpha Genome people did, which is quite nice, is they made it very clear in their preprint how these different ontologies and curated resources are used to align all of the different metadata, and they can actually be used at inference time as well. So you can actually query these genomic models using terms from ontologies like the cell ontology and Uberon. But I think it's limiting to just think of these as knowledge representation as driving predictive use cases. They serve a role in giving explanations as well. And so this is an example of something that we're doing as part of the Gene Ontology project. We've moved on to a new phase of annotation that we call Gene Ontology Causal Activity Models. The basic idea here is rather than just simply annotating genes with terms from the ontology, we can start to connect together the activities of those genes into larger graphs and larger pathways. This is an example of GoCams from the POMBase database. And so what the POMBase curators have done is essentially curated, the goal is to curate all of metabolism within POMBase. And what you can see here is how all of these different genes and their functions connect together, not only within pathways, but across pathways as well. And this will allow us to essentially do kind of like reasoning and metabolic modeling and kind of like predictive analytics over metabolism, and to get back, actual underlying explanations in terms of how these genes are connected together. So of course, as we heard from Amos's talk yesterday, this wonderful knowledge representation doesn't just arise out of nowhere. There is a lot of very careful modeling, curation, and ontology development that goes on behind the scenes to essentially take a lot of this unstructured or semi-structured knowledge that is in the literature, or maybe sometimes even in supplementary tables or in figures. And so curators have been working over the decades, as part of some of these major knowledge bases to essentially distill this into some kind of like form that is computable, whether that's an ontology or a knowledge base. But so I think many of us here are familiar with that, but I think what a lot of people might not realize is just the diversity of the tasks involved in curating some of these knowledge bases. Over on the left, this is the kind of things that I think people maybe think dominate the main activities in curation. And maybe there's a tendency to see this purely in an incremental way, where the job of an ontology developer is simply to take requests for new terms, maybe a new cell type, add it into the ontology, and then move on to the next item in the queue. Or maybe the job of a curator is just to read the literature, curate the next paper, add that into the knowledge base, move on to the next one. In fact, for many of the knowledge bases that I work on, we are much more interested in building up a larger, coherent, cohesive picture of biology. And this entails not really working in this kind of like one paper at a time or one term at a time paradigm. And in fact, what we do encompasses a huge range of activities. And this involves, as Amos said yesterday, just applying a lot of broad and deep knowledge. But especially for developing ontologies, it might involve complex refactors of ontologies, doing extensive literature reviews and deep dives, maybe working with logical reasoners and applying reasoners, adding axioms to ontologies, using these to kind of like figure out consistencies and so on. So there's a number of these tasks, and I'll try and give you a flavor of some of these. So one kind of key point here is that change is a constant with all of these knowledge bases. This is a figure from the Gene Ontology NAR paper, I think from 2019. And it's giving a kind of summary of some of the work that we do within the ontology called refactoring the ontology. And so we've intentionally borrowed this term. Those of you who are coming here from BOSC will probably be very familiar with the concept of refactoring in software. You're not just constantly adding new features to your software. You have to kind of go back and say, okay, well, maybe we didn't implement this in the optimal way. We need to go back and figure out a new way of doing it. It's exactly the same way with ontologies and knowledge bases. New knowledge arises all the time, or we figure out better ways of doing the things that we did before. And we have to go back and essentially rearrange things. And we can't do this in isolation. Once you start rearranging the top level of an ontology or adding new terms, you've got to coordinate with all of the different groups that are using that ontology to annotate their knowledge such that they can migrate things forward, or they can go back and re-annotate. This might entail going back to the literature and re-annotating some papers. And this can be kind of quite a time-consuming and complex process. And there's a process of negotiation there where we try and organize with our community and say, okay, well, we would like to do this refactoring. Will this cause you a lot of problems? If not, maybe we'll kind of like delay this for now. So it's a very kind of like, social kind of like dynamic changing process to keep all of this knowledge up to date. And so another kind of like perspective that I like to give is very nicely summarized in this this paper by Fabian Neuhaus and Jana Hastings, called Ontology Development is Consensus Creation, Not Merely Representation. So, not all of my colleagues might necessarily agree with this perspective, but I do see this a lot in a lot of the ontologies and the knowledge bases that we build. We're not simply kind of going out there and capturing facts that are stated in an individual paper. We're actually working with sometimes multiple different models of biology, and we're trying to kind of figure out the ways in which we can work with those members of the community and come up with some kind of like consensus representation of that knowledge. And sometimes that's not always possible, and you have to come up with compromises. So there's this very kind of like strong consensus social component to building these ontologies. And I think this is partly why we maybe don't see so many ontologies in OBO that have some kind of a consensus representation of fields like psychology, where there's maybe multiple kind of like competing models, and it's very hard to achieve kind of like one singular way of viewing the world. So we can actually quantify this. We can actually look at some of the statistics from GitHub. So in the ontology community, just like in the software community, we make heavy use of social coding mechanisms such as making GitHub issues, making pull requests, and so on. And you can actually go back and analyze that and see some of the dynamics of the community. And you can actually see that for every change that is made in the ontology, typically there's at least 2 people involved in that decision. And in many cases, multiple people might be involved if we're dealing with something kind of quite complex where we need to balance multiple different representations. And we can also track the number of comments that appear on those issues as well. And in some cases, it's just a straightforward adding a new term or fixing a typo or something like that. But you can see that there's some issues in the minority that might involve long, lengthy discussion processes over sometimes over years or longer. And I think some of the ontologists in the room here might not be surprised at this. We love to discuss things and thrash things out, but that may be kind of surprising to people who aren't used to working with ontologies. So some of this is nicely exemplified in some of the work that we do in Monarch on the Mondo ontology. And this happens in multiple other ontologies, such as the gene ontology as well. We will frequently have things such as content workshops, where we bring together different groups. For this epilepsy workshop, we brought together clinicians, geneticists, but also patient advocacy organizations as well, because we want to hear all the different perspectives on how we might classify a disease. And of course, bringing in our own kind of curators and ontology developers as well. And together with kind of like other institutes like the Critical Path Institute. And resulting from that workshop, we arrive at better representations in the ontology with maybe deeper classifications and classifications that have been vetted and kind of like discussed sometimes over multiple workshops with some of these different experts. So, so the question, that I think is on many people's mind is, okay, well, this is, clearly a lot of work to do all of this. Can we use, artificial intelligence and particularly large language models alone to help with this? And so, my answer here is when talking about, just this very kind of like simple paradigm of using ChatGPT as an oracle, you can do some, sometimes quite useful things like this. So I think when ChatGPT came out, what many of us did, one of the very first things that we did was like, can you make me an ontology of cats and dogs or food or immune cells or something like that? And we were maybe kind of quite impressed when it gave us something like this OBO format ontology on the right, because we'd never seen anything like that. But it turns out doing something like this is in itself is quite useless. This doesn't conform to any of our guidelines. For example, all of the terms that we typically add to an ontology should have some kind of like PubMed ID backing up the definition that we provide. Once you just start asking ChatGPT, working in isolation, oh, give me some PubMed IDs for all of these definitions, it will immediately start hallucinating numbers and things that look like PubMed IDs, but are actually for something completely random. So, but I think the key thing here is that these kind of toy examples where we just ask it to generate terms, they can be impressive, but they're not actually aligned with the tasks that we need help with in knowledge representation. And hopefully I've communicated that with just some of the range of tasks that I showed before. So the title here is maybe a little bit of a bait and switch, because I think my answer to can LLMs alone help with this is no. But if we start looking at some of the newer paradigms in AI, and in particular this idea of agentic AI, I think we'll see that this is actually much more aligned with the kind of tasks that we need help with in knowledge representation. So the whole concept of agentic AI actually it kind of goes back, I'm a kind of like good old-fashioned symbolic AI person from the 1990s. The concept of agentic AI has been with us for quite a long time, but it really started to gain prominence with the advent of generative AI. And this is, I think, one of the kind of keystone papers in the field. It's about the React pattern, and this is actually from 2022. This is from just before ChatGPT was released. People were already kind of like exploring these kinds of patterns. But the basic idea here is that if you ask an AI or a standalone LLM a question, this one is something about finding something about devices for your Apple TV or something like that. When you ask just ChatGPT alone, it will kind of give you insufficient answers because it's not really thought very hard about it, and it doesn't have access to any tools. But when you combine a language model with access to tools and with the ability, and this includes things like being able to look up things on the internet, and also with the ability to kind of like reason about your question and plan for it and task for it, it tends to perform much better. So this kind of came out in 2022. But we're starting to really see, an explosion of interest in agentic AI right now. There's a lot of interest in applying to scientific use cases, as we heard this morning. But where I think we're really seeing the effects of it is in software development. So software developers, not all of them. I know there's probably a very broad range of opinions here about how the utility of AI in software development. But I know for a fact many of you here have been eagerly adopting kind of like using AI for helping you kind of like code, going back from a few years ago to the kind of like initially kind of impressive autocomplete functions that you might have had in your PyCharm IDE or whatever. moving on to being able to kind of like paste things into ChatGPT and say, help me debug this piece of code or whatever. And now onto some of these newer kind of agentic programming paradigms where you can essentially use a tool like Claude Code, which is a simple little command line terminal-based tool where you can essentially ask it to give it a high-level task and have it go off, write the code for you. It'll do things like run the code and test it and write tests. And depending on your opinion, it either will just write complete garbage and you have to go back and spend hours and hours debugging this, or it's the best thing since sliced bread and it can automate all of your tests for you. I mean, and that kind of extreme is kind of like captured in this concept of vibe coding, which, the basic idea is you just give it the task and let it go off and kind of like build everything for you. I think, most of us who have kind of like used some of this technology end up somewhere in between, where I think going pure vibe coding and letting it do everything for you does tend to have disastrous effects a lot of the time. But at the same time, it would be foolish to kind of completely ignore this this technology. Anyway, it's being widely adopted by some segments of the software development community, and in the knowledge representation world, we often take some of the tools that have been developed for software development and adapt them to ontologies. But just to kind of give you a sense of why I think this is quite a promising technology for knowledge representation, this kind of like structure here gives you more of a sense of the kinds of tasks that we might want to do in knowledge representation. So the basic idea here is that we might want to add en masse to the cell ontology, transcriptomically identified molecular interneuron subtypes. And so the basic idea here is that we're rapidly adding terms to the cell ontology that are driven by new classifications, that are driven by transcriptomics, and this involves a number of different kind of like subtasks. And so agents, I think, are well suited to this kind of thing, because if you actually start breaking down what this involves, you can see this fits well into an agentic paradigm. The agent might decide to start by reviewing the existing terms in the ontology because it doesn't want to go and add duplicative terms, and it might want to do that using existing tools, such as tools that already exist, like ontology browsers like the OLS or BioPortal. It might want to do a survey of the literature, existing cell types that have been classified this way in PubMed, and it might want to do that using the NCBI eUtils API. It also needs to be able to handle things like checking out the ontology from Git or from GitHub, making edits to the ontology, using tools that we rely on heavily in ontology development, such as logical reasoners, to automate the classification, to check the consistency, and so on. And then, it might not get it right the first time, so it needs to go back and iterate over that task. So, the whole agentic paradigm is very well suited to these kind of like complex multi-step tasks. Okay, so how do we go about actually applying agentic AI to our field? So you can go online and you can say, you can just do a search for, which agentic framework should I use, and you will get back, thousands and thousands of results, and this is like one of them. And you might, rightly feel just a little bit overwhelmed by the range of different frameworks that are out there, and you feel you might need to be, an AI super genius to even start making use of some of this. And I think if you do want to do a lot of the cutting edge agentic AI research that we heard about this morning, you really do need to kind of like buckle down and learn some of these frameworks. But there is actually, a simpler path. And, the simpler path is inspired by what we do in ontology development a lot of the time, which is really just kind of like borrow and steal from what some of our colleagues in the software development community here at BOSC are doing. And so we actually kind of like do a lot of repurposing in the ontology world. Not everyone might be aware of that, but for all of these different software engineering paradigms, such as formal validation of linting, containerized continuous integration, development environments, we've kind of like made kind of purpose-based adaptations of that for for ontologies. In ontologies, we have validation and linting using logical frameworks like the web ontology language. We've adapted things like GitHub Actions to run kind of like validation tools such that every single pull request that someone makes to an ontology is checked, thanks to the ontology development kit. And we have analogs of the tools that software developers use, like PyCharm, in the form of ontology development environments such as Protege, which is unfortunately no longer funded at the moment. So just following this kind of like general idea of kind of like adapting existing tools, we thought, well, what happens if we just take some of the existing coding agents that exist out there, like Claude Code or Gemini CLI, and just kind of essentially adapt them. Don't change the code, but just give them different instructions and see how well they work for building ontologies rather than building software. And so we call this the semantic coding agent pattern. But really, it's fairly simple. And the basic idea is that whereas the ontologist or the curator might typically sit down with some kind of like specialized interface for curating knowledge, such as the Protege ontology development environment, here they can swap that or mix and match and make use of an existing coding agent like Claude Code and use that rather than editing Python files or what have you, just edit the OBORL files, which are the formats that we use for developing ontologies. And this would just go through all of the normal processes that we use for developing these. We would typically always check both automatically and manually the results of this by going through the normal standard pull request review process. So one idea here is that everyone essentially can become an agent programmer here. All you need to do is essentially gives the agent some instructions. Now, people kind of like make fun of this idea of kind of like prompt engineering, and you can get a PhD in prompt engineering now at some institutes, which is obviously very silly. But at the same time, there is, not everyone can simply go and write instructions that are going to be very effective for using agents. It does take a little bit of kind of expertise and kind of like going back and forth to really figure out the right kind of patterns. And you can think of this as almost like onboarding a new ontology developer. You have to think of the best ways in which to communicate some of the tasks that you do and some of the best practices that you have for developing your ontology. So at the end of the day, it's still relatively simple. And what we end up doing is just checking into our GitHub repos, just a simple markdown file that says, here's our ontology, here's what we put in it, here's what we don't put in it. These are the files that you edit. Here's an example of this kind of term. Here's an example of that kind of term. Do this, don't do that. Sometimes you have to put in capital letters or lots of exclamation marks. Never, never do this. It's a little bit, fuzzy compared to normal programming, but that's, the basic idea here is like, anyone can become an agent programmer. But the other aspect of agents is the tools themselves. So an agent is only really as good as the tools it can use. But fortunately, in the ontology development community, we have a lot of existing tools. Thanks to some people here in the audience who have developed tools that form. Many of these have been Dockerized as part of the ontology development kit. This includes things like the robot all-purpose ontology processing tool. You can use this to run different reasoners and so on to check your ontology. We also have tools that will do things like full text lookup of publications, tools for being able to search over an ontology, such as the ontology access kit, tools such as LinkML and LinkML validate that can be used to make sure that any changes that you make conform to a schema. You can wrap some of these tools for agents using protocols such as the Model Context Protocol, which a lot of people are very keen on at the moment. But to be honest, most of these tools already have command line interfaces, and that's essentially all a lot of these agents need. And on top of that, many of these agents have agentic tools have their own built-in ways, built-in tools for being able to do things like web search or edit files and so on. And it turns out just with some markdown instructions and a bunch of tools that can be run on the command line, you can do some fairly powerful things. So there's a number of different ways you can actually start invoking these agents. So there's, I've organized this from the kind of like the simple, from the harder, more technical way to the maybe the easier but less flexible way of doing things. So if you're already kind of like familiar with things like, you know, the Unix command line, you might be comfortable using tools like Claude Code or Codex or Gemini CLI. There's new tools kind of like coming out every month for this kind of thing. But that's maybe a slightly kind of like geeky or nerdy way of interacting with these. There's an increasing number of desktop UIs that are kind of generic, and you can just start kind of like plugging in some of these tools. And this includes things like the Goose desktop tool and Claude Desktop. But yeah, what we've tended to find is, these tools are maybe still just a little bit too kind of like generic and hard to use for the average ontology developer or curator. So we're starting to find that just running these tools in essentially headless mode and incorporating them into GitHub Actions can be the easiest way of running these. And just quite recently, you may have seen that you can actually within GitHub, if you have certain kind of like, permissions enabled and you've got an education-based account, you can start doing things like assigning PRs to Copilot. And if you do that in combination with some of these instructions in these tools, it can actually start doing some fairly powerful things. But it's still an evolving, complex landscape. So we decided we really need to start documenting a lot of the best practices and the patterns and some of the ways in which you can start deploying some of these tools. So we've made a website here, AI for Curation, AI Docs. This is all built using just standard kind of like GitHub Make Docs type tools. This means anyone can come along here and make PRs and changes to the documentation. We hope this becomes a community site that many people can come and start contributing their own kind of experiences and best practices. And we've started deploying this in experimental mode for a number of different semantic resources. We've started deploying this for some of the ontologies I work on, like Go and Uberon and Mondo. We've actually started deploying it for some of our semantic schemas as well, such as BioLink, for some of our registries, like our knowledge graph registry, and also for some kind of curation and knowledge graph projects, such as the modern pathophysiology annotations. And we're piloting at the moment. We don't allow anyone to trigger some of these GitHub Actions. You have to have undergone some kind of like training to be able to give the AI the right kind of instructions, and then we add you to the permissions list. But it's generally kind of like fairly straightforward. And we're starting to just kind of collect some examples of cases where this works well and where it doesn't work well. Where maybe unsurprisingly it does tend to work well is in handling pull requests where the person making the pull request, handling issues where the person making the issue has already done a lot of the work up front. So on the left, you can see an issue made by a member of the Uberon community, and they're requesting a new term. And because I happen to know this person, they're actually worked on the gene ontology previously, so they're very kind of familiar with ontology. So they gave a very kind of like clear request of what they wanted adding to the ontology. So unsurprisingly, the pull request that gets made by the agent is actually kind of like, perfect for this, and it can easily be merged. Unsurprisingly, also just making requests for simple changes to the ontologies, fixing typos and definitions, fixing incorrect edges in the knowledge graph. This also tends to work fairly well, as you might expect, because there's not a lot of ambiguity in the task that needs to be handled here. But we can start trying other more complex things as well. We can essentially have our own mini deep research kind of like platform using this paradigm. and you can actually go in and make issues where you request things like, in this particular case, I was looking at one of the terms in Mondo for alpha-gal syndrome, which is this immune disease that's kind of like sweeping the east coast of the US. It's transmitted by a tick bite, and it makes people allergic to dairy and meat. And I noticed that a lot of the information we had in it was quite out of date. So I requested it to do a kind of like deep research of the literature and align that with what is in the ontology as well. And it will go off and do that. And what's quite nice is it will essentially communicate back the findings as a part of the general conversation in the GitHub issue. So you can see it's kind of like interacting with us in the same way that maybe an expert coming to our GitHub tracker might interact in the same way. So I particularly like this use case here. This is a kind of like a task that is unfortunately kind of quite frequent with a lot of our ontologies, and it does require some it's non-trivial. It requires some knowledge to know how to implement, but it is kind of like entirely mechanical and not really much fun to do. So this example here is we noticed in Mondo that we had been using CDC URLs as provenance for a lot of our definitions and for a lot of the statements in the ontology. And of course, CDC has always been a great source for that. But many URLs for government sites, have broken in the past, and many of them are tending to break a lot more frequently now. So we set the agent with the task of going and finding potential replacements for these URLs. And it was able to kind of actually figure out that there is an actual archive site on the CDC, and there's a kind of like a general pattern that you can use to rewire some of these URLs, but not all of them conform to it. So it went off and kind of like found maybe equivalent URLs and from different sources. And of course, it delivers all of this in the form of a pull request that we can review and request modifications on if we don't like what it's doing. So, I think it's, it can potentially be very useful for this kind of mechanical, time-consuming, not particularly scientific, but important task. And we're using it not just for ontologies, but we're using it for other kinds of semantic artifacts as well. So we can use this with semantic registries, such as this is the knowledge graph registry. And we can also use it to help us maintain some of the semantic schemas that we have, like BioLink as well. But it's not all roses. There's many cases where the agents will still, even though this agentic pattern can mitigate some of the issues with hallucinations, sometimes if you set things off along a certain path and give it the opportunity, it just loves to hallucinate PubMed IDs. So there's various mitigations that we can use on top of this using kind of multi-agent systems. But at the moment, this is just something that we try and kind of like pay attention to. And in this particular case, just the curator got very frustrated here and kind of like went back, asked for changes. It didn't do the right thing. She went back and asked for further changes on top of that. And at the end of the day, she said, this took me like 10 times longer than if I had just done it myself. So we're still figuring out the patterns of where it's useful and where it's reliable to do this. And we want to do this in a systematic way. Unfortunately, evaluating agents is non-trivial. This is not like a standard machine learning or NLP task where you've got a simple gold standard where you're extracting a term from some text or something like that. The tests here are, by their nature, they're very kind of like open-ended and unconstrained, and there's often multiple ways to arrive at the correct answer, or maybe multiple different endpoints that you can reach. So there's a lot of work right now in agents for bioinformatics, for general kind of like bioinformatics analysis tasks. We heard some of this this morning. There's also a number of kind of like benchmarks like BixBench that people spend a lot of time curating these benchmarks that will tell you maybe the kind of like the answer that you might want to arrive at after analyzing some gene expression data or something like that. But so far there's not been the equivalent kind of benchmarks for some of these knowledge representation tasks, and it could be quite a lot of work to build up these benchmarks. But fortunately, within a lot of the knowledge representation community, we have been using GitHub for some time, and we can actually make use of that GitHub history to help automate generation of benchmarks. So this is like the issue history in the gene ontology. This goes back to 2002. Of course, there was no GitHub in 2002. We wrote some scripts that we used SourceForge before that. I remember SourceForge, and migrated all our issues into GitHub because we really, really, really care about having this unbroken kind of like history of everything. Oh, okay, 5 minutes. Very good. In that case, I'm going to just skip over some of the benchmarking. I'll just kind of like give you a kind of like a flavor of some of the challenges that we have with benchmarking some of these tasks. So we've essentially built this something we call Scribe for semantic coding, reasoning, and inference benchmark evaluation. And the basic idea is you mine GitHub history to generate these benchmarks, and then you can use this to essentially kind of like evaluate, compare what the ontology editor did maybe like 5 years ago. You can hide that information from the AI, make it do the same task, and compare them. It won't always it might achieve the correct result by doing something different. It may use different text definitions or so on. So that makes some challenges with some of the evaluation. I'll just kind of like very quickly give you a sense of some of the results. Unfortunately, the open models are not yet up to the task of doing some of this this kind of complex agentic workflow using ontologies. We're hoping they're going to catch up soon, but right now the winners are Claude Sonnet and Gemini 2.5. But fortunately, one nice result is that you're not locked into using some of the coding agents that are developed by some of these companies like OpenAI, or Claude Code, which really wants you to use kind of like Claude models. You can actually use generic tools like Goose, and it seems to work, which can interoperate with any of these models, and it seems to work just as well. But we really need to do manual evaluation on this as well. So I'm going to kind of quickly pivot into some of the non-technical aspects of deploying AI for knowledge representation. And some of the kind of questions that we've been having are, should some of these agents have their own code of conduct? How do we deal with kind of issues like provenance? Like, should agents get their own ORCID IDs? I don't think ORCID would be very happy if we tried to register an ID for an agent, but we need some way of kind of like tracking, what they're doing and capturing some detail, like the actual kind of like tool chains that they used. We've started to build up some, as part of our general kind of like Monarch best practice documentation. We've started kind of building up our own AI guidelines. I encourage you, many of you who are working on knowledge bases to do similar things. I want to sidebar for a bit just into this kind of question of AI alignment. And I want to preface this just by saying everything you saw before is the work of many people that we've been doing as part of my normal kind of like professional activities. What you're going to hear now, this does not, I want to be very clear, this does not represent the opinions of my my organization, and all of the experiments I did here, I paid for myself using my own API keys. But as I'm sure you're all aware, there's many challenges and many potential objections to using a lot of these large AI models, especially some of these more commercial models. There's multiple levels of lack of transparency in how they're constructed, both at the pre-training level. They're trained on like huge amounts of information, often of dubious quality on the internet. Then there's a kind of like a process that is not always very open, where they're essentially kind of like tuned for prompts, and then there's a kind of system prompt layer on top of that as well. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are kind of like people who have been trying to manipulate some of this process, including the world's richest man, who also owns one of the main frontier models out there. And he seems to think that the AI that he has built is in some sense too woke. So he's been trying to essentially kind of like manipulate it to give answers that he likes. And this has kind of like absolutely disastrous results, turning the AI into a mecha Hitler in its own words. On top of this landscape, we're facing a lot of challenges in science where, those of us in the US are now being forced, or maybe kind of like strong arm to comply with executive orders. This includes things like Executive Order 14168, which dictates this kind of language that we can use to describe things like sex and gender. And many of us who work on knowledge bases are being essentially forced to change terms on our websites, but also in the content of the things that we produce as well. So this is a fairly well-known and well-used ontology that was essentially, as part of kind of anticipatory obedience, kind of essentially retired a number of concepts in the ontology relating to gender identity in order to conform with this executive order. I won't mention the name of the ontology. You know, many of us are being, you know, strongly suggested that we kind of like follow these kinds of recommendations. So I think this is a very disturbing development, no matter what you think about the ontological representation of sex and gender. These terms have been actually in use for kind of like serious use cases for a while. And I don't think it's a good development that we're being kind of like told top down what kind of terms we should put in our ontology. So I tried an experiment. I thought, well, what if we did move towards having the content of ontologies be more driven by kind of like agents operating on kind of like requests that come from outside? How would an AI handle being given this kind of order? And my hypothesis to this going in is we can build guardrails. We can give the AI instructions that instill it with our scientific values, and hopefully it wouldn't, you know, maybe kind of like comply in such a ruthless fashion. So the very first experiment I did is I kind of created kind of like a copy of this ontology, and I set it up with the agent framework, and I immediately asked it. So the slide is not advancing. Is there someone in Doge here? Have I been cut off? The slide is not advancing.
Not all.
It is an AI transmission, so probably.
Let's just try closing and opening it again. That might literally just fix it. If nothing else, then. Nope. So it's the problem with the.
Okay.
We're at time if you summarize it, and then we'll go into discussion.
Okay. So I did the experiment where I used the agent to essentially try and kind of like, I saw what would happen if you instructed the agent to comply with the executive order. And not surprisingly, it did. And it kind of like retired all the gender concepts in this shadow copy of this ontology. But I thought I could influence it. And I thought I could give it some high-level instructions. I should point to the code of conduct. So all of our ontologies that we use in OBO have a standard code of conduct that talks about how we respect gender diversity. And every experiment I tried, it would just make the same changes. And when I told it to comply with the code of conduct, it actually made a pull request that changed the code of conduct to conform with the executive order, which was, I was not too pleased with that. But anyway, I had some concluding slides that it had some jokes about the Beatles, but anyway, I did want to end on a kind of like a more positive note. And I think that kind of like the key take home from my conclusions is I really think, we have a broad range of, I really didn't cover the full range of kind of potential kind of like objections to some of this technology. I know we've got a wide range of opinions on this here, but I really think this technology is incredibly powerful. It is going to disrupt the knowledge representation space. And I think it's really important that we all kind of like work together and kind of figure out the best patterns and the guardrails and the patterns and what works and what doesn't. And, we can use this to kind of really elevate what we do, but at the same time have the necessary guardrails in place. So thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. And think about your questions carefully since we're being monitored. Okay, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for this insightful talk. I was wondering, given that we managed to then reconstruct this super nice and very dense and integrated knowledge graph, one thing that I always wondered around and also coincidentally based my PhD research on is how then we extract context-specific information in the sense of arbitrarily specific, arbitrarily narrowed down information from this super dense and integrated knowledge.
Yeah. This is something I'm really interested in. When a lot of my colleagues in the knowledge graph community, we love to kind of like build up these kind of subject, predicate, object knowledge graphs, and it's like this protein interacts with this protein, or this protein has this function. What we tend to find though with biology is a lot of the useful and interesting stuff is much more contextual and contingent. It's like this protein interacts with this in the cell type, or when exposed to this kind of drug. And I think, and you can go a long way with just sort of simple patterns for triple extraction using just plain LLMs. I think where the agentic approach really excels is in capturing a lot of this contextual information as well. Using things like deep research patterns where you can go off and collate some of the information from the literature that will give you a more kind of like nuanced picture of how it's not simply a matter of A interacting with B, but it's much more contextual.
And we have perhaps time for just one more, if there is one more.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, great talk. I missed the beginning, so sorry if I ask a stupid question. Provenance is a very important piece here, what you have up there. So yes, a lot of repositories are having to deal with this, with the insight that we may have to undo this.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on provenance?
That is a great question. I love that. So, many of us in this room here have been thinking deeply about provenance in the context of ontologies for a long time. We do have best practices that are used already. We always track, who made a change to the ontology and what group they're associated within. But the key thing is we always tie it back to the GitHub history as well. So for any change and this is true regardless of AI, you can go back and for at least more changes that were made more recently, you can always tie it back into the GitHub history. We don't have great ways to make that very easy for users to explore at the moment, but we know we can retrace the history of changes and tie it back to GitHub issues and say, this is the reason why this was changed. This was the discussion that we had. And, I think we definitely need to layer on top of those kind of mechanisms, but we need additional mechanisms as well. We need to be able to kind of like go back to the reason or trace that the AI made and look at the chain of tool calls that it made and see that, oh, okay, it was actually access, doing this kind of web search there and looking at PubMed, hence we may not trust its results so much.
All right, so this is a wonderful way to officially begin our AI session, but let's thank Chris for that thought-provoking talk.